I think it's our responsibility to stand firm in truth. And especially, I feel as a young person, it's my responsibility to do that when I see my generation going the opposite direction. So if we're not doing it, then no one's going to, and we're going to keep going down the rabbit hole.
Hey, how are you? Happy spring, culminators. Grace Reilly is a young woman who I had the pleasure of meeting after being an online friend for a while at last year's CPAC. This year I didn't go to CPAC because I was making a wedding, which was an even more profound political statement. But I decided to make up for it by having Grace back on the show. She is going places. She's going to catch us all up, and there's no agenda here. She's got nothing to sell. And I mean, yes, it's always nice to have a really pretty person, whether they're male or female, on the show. But let's face it, I, I drag it down on the other end. So that's not what I'm selling you. Grace, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me back. It's really fun to be here, especially I think it's been a year since I was on the show last,
Yeah.
and loved coming on the show. Always loved keeping up with it, so I'm happy to be back.
So that's great because I hate when people come back bitterly angry that I'm making them do the show.
Yeah,
So
exactly. It's a good combination.
yes, thank it is. And you meanwhile have become you're just taking off exactly as I predicted. I actually lost the spreadsheet. I had it all worked out here. I knew you're you're still in school, right?
So I'm finishing up school still. I'm at Grove City College, and we'll be graduating very, very soon. It's getting close.
Oh, in other words, that's this spring.
Mhm.
And are you set up for after graduation?
Yeah, so after graduation, so I've actually started working already. So since last coming on the show, a lot has happened.
Yes, I
I've
noticed.
worked for the American Spectator since then, and also now I'm working for Restoration of America, which I will continue to do after graduation.
So American Spectator, that was in the nature of an internship, I guess.
Yeah, so it was an internship this past summer. It turned to more of just being a contributor where I was contributing reports, and that's something that I'm going to be continuing.
Wow,
And also, yeah.
that's fantastic. So I am American Spectator really helped make me what I am today. I was in high school. Okay, this was a little bit after Abe Lincoln. Uh, and I was what was this? I wish I could remember why my comparative literature teacher in 12th grade gave me a copy of the old American Spectator, which was printed on newsprint. This must have been 1980. And it was about Solzhenitsyn. It was an article about Solzhenitsyn, and I was hooked. I mean, the style of writing and the whole. I mean, I had never really read conservative opinion writing before, and I never came back from that trauma.
Yeah.
And I became, and then to think that I became friendly with Melissa. Uh, I always want to call her by her old last name because that's how far back we go. Um, Melissa
Mackenzie.
McKenzie. Uh, and I was on her show and she was on my show, and then poof, there's Grace doing Americans. How did you swing that? Like they were just recruiting at Grove City and you
Yeah,
applied, or
well, so what happened? First off, what you just explained about how you came to know the American Spectator reminds me a lot of Dr. Paul Kengor, who is the editor of the American Spectator. So him being the editor, he actually is a professor at Grove City College. So
uh
I've worked very closely with him, and through that, that's how I found out about the American Spectator and ended up doing the internship. And he had a really similar story where when he was younger, I can't remember, I think it may have been when he was in college, he came, or maybe even before that, he came across some of the American Spectator's writing and loved it and didn't turn back. And the reason being that not only is it conservative commentary in a sense, but it was witty, in that unique way where it's funny, it's enjoyable to read, and it still has that. And the American Spectator takes pride in that it's still witty commentary, and you do find all perspectives there. Like, I mean, you find writer, I mean, just to put it most simply, I mean, in terms of the election, there are people who support Trump, who can't stand Trump. They're all over the place, but it's always really interesting commentary from multiple perspectives. That's fun to read at the same time.
And of course, they're still printing Ben Stein.
Yes, he writes a lot.
And I was reading Ben Stein before he became a movie star. And then I got to appear on stage with him at some conference with James O'Keefe. And I guess I should be fair to listeners slash viewers. Episode 110, when you last appeared, is where we tell the story. The way you came to my attention was not when we met at CPAC, but that I saw that you were a young woman who was working hard in the conservative social media space and had things to say, and who was also a woman of faith, which always catches my attention because I think that's really the battleground uh, of where the fight really is. And a lot of our fellow conservatives, I think, haven't gotten that yet. But then again, there's a certain amount of grace that's required in order to get it. You have to, you have to find yourself to God before you can make God part of your platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we talked a lot about on the last episode and that we agreed upon. I come from it from a Christian perspective, you come from a Jewish perspective, and we both agree on the foundations of the tenets of religion and how important they are in society, in conservatism, in culture, in education, in all the ways, how that really is the cornerstone. And I think that's awesome that we agree on that and can talk about that. And I agree that conservatives are kind of behind on that in some senses, where I think leaving that out is a big mistake, which I think we can see play out.
And so I'm going to throw something at you that I have thrown at some much more seasoned commentators, and it's not to trip you up. It's because I don't know the answer to the question, and I think I first had this. I'm a little name dropping here, but I think I had some of my most challenging conversations on this issue with Michael Knowles. And Michael is a very proud Catholic and a brilliant guy, great sense of humor, good looking. I want to be Michael Knowles. Let's not kid ourselves.
Michael Knowles is great. This makes sense too that he would have had an interesting response to it. He's awesome.
So Michael wants, he's taking a position that a lot of conservatives do, especially what we might call cultural conservatives, saying toleration has got to be limited. Yes, it's a pluralistic society, but we don't have to and we shouldn't tolerate conduct and maybe even expression which threatens our ability to remain a tolerant society. And that's really that statement in and of itself makes a certain amount of sense. And his test, I would say, Michael, how do you know though? Where are we going to draw that line? Instead of asking, what would Jesus do? He says, what would the founding fathers do? What would the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution say about uh, witchcraft as a recognized religion and devil worship? And okay, that's a point of view, and it's hard as a lawyer and someone who's involved in constitutional law to grab a hold of it. That was all to frame the question, because I'm not going to actually ask you that question, because I don't think this. But we're seeing in the last year a tremendous amount of very vocal activism on the part of American Muslims. Not all Muslims, but a very different kind of approach to how an immigrant class or a refugee class or even a second generation class views their role in a pluralistic society. So you said a couple minutes ago, Jews and Christians can agree, and people like you and I do agree on the civil arrangement that we're going to come to. What do we do? What do we do with the Muslims? I mean, if you ever, I don't want to get you in trouble, and if you say something really stupid, we won't use it. But there's something different here, right? There's something different.
No, I think that's an excellent question, especially to consider at this time. And I will say, just before getting into it, the first thing I thought of when you were mentioning your conversation with Michael Knowles kind of has to do with the fact that, well, in a postmodern society where no one can agree on what truth is and what certainty is, that's the starting point there. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. How do we know where the line is? Well, I think we have to work backwards and, kind of hammer down on the fact that there is objective truth. And because of that, there has to be objective right and wrong. And that wasn't something that was up for debate years ago. It wasn't something controversial years ago. People weren't confused about basic truths and realities. But now there's all sorts of confusion around what's moral, what's not moral, what's true, what's not. And, a lot of people holding to the fact that there's no real truth. You can have your own truths and your perspective makes up anything important. So that's the first problem. I think they're just working backwards a little, where of course we're going to have a lot of conflict and just division in that sense.
In other words, I think we can agree there's a lack of moral consensus,
Yes.
even among, and a lot of people are under the misapprehension that people who view things the way you and I do have an unrealistic view about historical figures and the founding fathers themselves. And they're like, well, they didn't go to church. They weren't really, a lot of them really Christians, strictly speaking. They were deists. Yeah, but again, going back to Michael's test, they had besides knowing what a man was and what a woman was, they had an idea of right and wrong. Let's please put slavery aside. I know slavery, like sex, ruins everything, but they had a pretty good idea of right and wrong
It
and a
was unifying.
vocabulary. I'm sorry?
It was unifying. People agreed.
Right. So even I'm a student of Churchill. Churchill was not a religious man, but all of his writings ring with a reaffirmation of Christian values as the framework for how to view civilization, even though he was not, again, he not a real church-going man, but it was sincerely held. He wasn't. This is stuff that he wrote in his diary, stuff that he understood that this was the basis of civilization. Okay, now back to your answer to my very long question.
Yeah, so back to that answer. I think it's a hard one, obviously. But there are a few things that I think we should think about and consider just as insofar as understanding the differences here. Part of the problem and the reason that this is even a question is because, and again, this is not all Muslims, but a good group of them, based on especially the tenets of their religion, don't assimilate, right? They immigrate to this is seen in Europe, here in the United States. They're immigrating to all these places. They're not assimilating and there is a camp of them. So there are people who take the doctrine of Islam more seriously than others and see jihad and taking over kind of and dominating as important. So what I mean by that in this sense is that that may mean not assimilating into a culture and kind of making basically having the end goal of turning places into how they would see their religion and culture playing out. Now, when we're looking at that in our society now in the United States, that's very serious. And it's also very serious in Europe. And we can see that playing out in Europe, where you have these nations completely changing, their identities kind of being washed away. And that's extremely significant. And that's something that should be thought about, considered. And it's difficult to say, well, what's the solution here? What do we do? Because we don't want to fall into doing the wrong thing in a sense or being discriminatory, but that those are true facts. And there's also the reality. So when we're looking at immigration, there are countries, mostly in the Middle East, Africa, so there are countries across the world which are terrorist hotbeds. So taking away even Muslim or anything, there are certain nations that are hotbeds for terrorism, Islamic extremism specifically. And there have been increased numbers of people who are immigrating here to the United States from those countries illegally in a lot of cases. One of the things I reported on at the American Spectator was the increase in terror watch list apprehensions at the southern border. So in the last fiscal year, it was about 600, I believe, that were apprehended at the southern, it was the southern and northern borders, right? So people who are either on the terror watch list, who are, in line, who are associated with people who are, and also just people who are coming to the United States from countries across the world, from China also, right? So from China to, so basically from United States adversaries. And that's something also that we should be looking at and considering. That's a bit apart from the answer to your question. They're kind of two different things, right? Because there are people who come through legally, and that's kind of a different thing, but also there's that problem.
And there was an historical understanding. I mean, look, there have always been debates about immigration. And 100 years ago, the question was, if we keep letting Eastern and Central Europeans in, they're not like the Western Europeans who founded this country, and they will debase the culture, and they don't share our values. And that isn't the kind of discussion that we can have now, but it's really, we're saying the same thing. The question is, when we look back, was it really wrong? Well, okay, well, who are we talking about? We're talking to a large extent about Jews and Italians. Um, I'm going to say something that no one else can say to you, which is that I think Jews, well, first of all, Jews and Italians made up a tremendous percentage of the criminals in New York City when my father was growing up in the Lower East Side in the 1930s and 40s. But the difference was, in the case of both, that after a generation of assimilation, and what people don't realize, that a lot of professional boxers and athletes were Jews and Italians. And people went through these different stages of assimilation, but then they did assimilate culturally and become, and embraced American values and got high, became educated and excelled. And here in New Jersey, where I practice law, all the lawyers are Jews and Italians. Now, I do know Muslim lawyers, but there was, even though it was Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and it wasn't Western Europe, there was something about Europe that was different from Somalia. And we don't have the vocabulary, I think, to express, people really think that if you have a problem with the conduct of a certain group that happens to have a particular ethnic composition, that you're prejudiced against that ethnicity. And that's a mistake. Um, I don't really care what color someone's skin is. I care whether or not they're going to be good citizens.
Well, and that's why too, it's so specifically we've been talking about Muslims, but also anyone who's trying to immigrate uh illegally, by the way. So there are plenty of people coming from all over the world across the southern border more specifically, but also the northern border illegally, right? So already aren't respecting the laws in the first place, and that presents the same kinds of questions, problems, also evidence, right? So there's been evidence of, again, just taking advantage of the law, not having respect for America, taking advantage of things, not wanting to assimilate necessarily. So that kind of just stands in general when we have this chaos that we have right now, in a sense.
There really is a sense of societal chaos. And I think, you've brought up, you have brought up immigration a couple of times, and quite rightfully, because it stands in for so much of what's going wrong with what we're talking about. Right off the bat, when a country announces, we don't have borders and we don't have an immigration policy, and we're going to lie about it. And not only are we going to lie about it, we're going to import illegal immigrants illegally and keep it. All these things that are going on, it so undermines the entire premise of what a nation state is.
Yeah, and that with I just think back to the State of the Union where President Biden decided to say that he's done a great job with the border. I found that the most baffling part of the entire thing, that he not only brought up the border when it's in such disarray, and that's agreed upon, it is a crisis, an open border, all sorts of chaos and unrest, and it's pretty out of control. He brought it up and said that he's been doing a good job.
Well, we are in an era of bold-faced lying from the very, very top that has never existed in our country before. You've got this guy Mayorkas getting in front of Congress and consistently saying under oath that the border's under control and we're fine. And there it we've gone past the point of we know they're lying to the point where a lot of people who share my views are, and I share this view as well, are saying they know we know they're lying and they're announcing their lack of concern about our knowing it. It's really, I mean, the FBI, though, this goes beyond religious faith. I mean, we can't even agree on what the most basic fundamental ways of running a society are.
Yeah, and that's the problem too. We already have a crisis of national identity where we can't agree on those things. We can't agree on what our national identity should be. Now, we obviously have our own thoughts on that, and we can look to history and whatnot, but I mean, I think that's the most troubling thing, that beyond that, people are allowed to just lie, make these statements, misuse language, and it's just okay. And an example that I think of just has to do even just with some of the messaging around Israel from the media. It's a People are allowed to just report some things and it's just fine, and there's no consequences if you want to misreport things. There's no consequences if you want to misuse language. It's just allowed. And that's, again, part of the problem where everyone can have their own truth. People are allowed to just make all sorts of claims and no repercussions, which is new.
I think it is. I mean, it there's so much that's coming apart, and I think we're going to start to bore people who are listening because they're nodding their heads. They know, they agree with us. You're nonetheless throwing yourself into a lifetime of activism because you obviously think it makes a difference. Why do you think it makes a difference? So many people in social media and where else do I have these conversations? Uh, so listen, it's hopeless. We're just going down the tubes. Why even bother? Stock up, run for the hills. Buy your cans of tuna. Why are you throwing yourself into? And I want to talk about restoration of America and specifically, but why bother?
Well, I think that the simple answer is that because it does make a difference. And the reason is, if we're not speaking for truth, if we're not, in a sense, reminding everyone of truth, because I feel like that's what it's come to, then who is? I think it's our responsibility to stand firm in truth. And especially, I feel as a young person, it's my responsibility to do that when I see my generation going the opposite direction. So if we're not doing it, then no one's going to, and we're going to keep going down the rabbit hole. So in a sense, I think it's worth it because this is what we can control. This is what we can do, even amidst the things that we can't control, where things do seem a little hopeless at times. What I can do, what you can do and do on your show, what we can all do is try to make a difference in our own lives, whether that's talking to people in our families, communities, trying to share the truth on social media, trying, and beyond that, just trying to share different perspectives so that instead of people only hearing what they hear from the media or only hearing more talking points on the left, which does dominate a lot of younger people's social media since it dominates Hollywood, um, and a lot of what people are more in tune to, if we're not standing against that and trying to be a voice for an opposite point of view, then I think people won't get that. And I think that people do change their minds. And what we can do is try to change people's minds, even if it's you can't control everyone, you can still make a difference in your capacity to.
I agree with what you just said, but I'm curious about the extent to which you think you're being heard by anyone outside the silo.
Mhm.
People, we're so polarized at this point. But you must have personal experiences of encountering and communicating with people who maybe at the beginning of that meeting might have been very disinclined toward listening to you.
Mm. Yeah, and that's something I've experienced more in my own life, if that makes sense. So, obviously, doing the social media and talking about politics, people in my normal life sphere know about that and don't necessarily agree with me. Now, sometimes that comes with just pretty adamant opposition and hatred and hate comments and all the sort. But other times, people are inclined to listen because when approaching topics in a respectful way, which I always try to do, it does work sometimes where people at least will listen and think about it. It's kind of planting a seed, as we say in the faith. You're planting seeds where people might listen to some of the questions that they have in their minds, and where I've experienced people actually changing their minds on certain issues and then digging more into things on their own.
Well,
So it is possible.
your analogy to what I suppose Christians would call witnessing,
Mhm.
you know, to the idea of talking about matters of faith to people who really have no inclination to listen. You say, well, why bother? I think it's a very important point that you make because you can really plant, you really can plant seeds. You really can get people, but just by juxtaposing some ideas. And I think that Ben Shapiro has been very effective with this. Even though every time he and people like him, and including you, who come onto a campus to give a talk, and there's all this resistance, but at the end of the day, people ask questions, and the questioner may not really be interested in the answer, but someone in that room is,
Yeah.
and people start people start thinking about the conversations that they've heard.
Well, and that's exactly the point. You never know with social media who you're reaching, who you may be impacting, or who may go away and think about the idea later. And the same is true with witnessing the faith, as you said. But even as far as politics go, the other reason it's important is because we care about people, right? We want society to be the best that it can be. We want to preserve America. We want the best for people. We want people's lives to be the best that they can be, which is impacted by the government they live under. So we want policies to benefit people. So with that being considered, it's important because that's the reason why we advocate for certain ideas and policies. So of course, we want people to see where we're coming from with them and, hopefully come to agreement and promote those ideas themselves as we work together towards a better country. I mean, that's the whole point. It's for that reason, and for that reason, it's impactful.
I think it is, but there are going to be moments, I'm sure, and you've probably had them already, where it gets you down, that you seem like you're really not making
Yeah.
progress.
Well, and I think too, it's important to remember that you're not going to change everyone's minds. There are always going to be people who disagree with you who will never change their minds. And that's something I find particularly frustrating. A lot of people will hear one little talking point and then die on that hill, even if they've done no research about the topic otherwise. And that's something that I think's really difficult to combat, especially as conservatives now, where people can take positions politically by hearing very little information or seeing one social media swipe post, and then decide that's the side they've picked. That's what is called the good side. End of story. So it's hard to change someone's mind that has dug their feet into the ground, and I would say pridefully stays there if they're not willing to at least listen to reasoning from the other side or even from their own side.
Tell me about Restoration America, which I would say is an organization that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah,
Uh,
so it's a really great organization. I started working there about, I want to say a month ago now. Um, but you can even go to the mission statement there. It should be an about, but or if you just click on about maybe. Or restoration pack, try that. But it's a wonderful company that is dedicated to preserving the foundation of America, and we do a variety of things both on the front of working in actual elections and also in just promoting the ideas for educational purposes. And something that I'll tell you all about because I think you'll find it of interest is that we just started a language watch series, which I'm late to this project. So I just started working there and I've been helping to kind of disperse it on social media. But Dan Curry and his team have done a wonderful job on these videos. And what it is it takes phrases that have been misused by the left and by the right, and identifies why they're propaganda and why we should be careful about how we're redefining language and allowing it to be politically manipulated. So the first two videos we just released, one was on gun violence, the other was on climate change, and they're just 1 minute videos. They come out every 2 weeks, and they're breaking down these terms and when I heard about this project, I was very excited because I thought, what a great idea, because the misuse of language for propaganda purposes in politics runs rampant, and no one's really doing anything about it. Instead, the right kind of just starts using the left's language in a sense, if that makes sense. So, yes, this is the second video we just released yesterday. Um, but really, it makes the point that, again, with climate change specifically, we've always been hearing the climate's warming, so it's global warming. Then we heard global cooling. And through all of that, finally, the left came to climate change and just puts it over anything. So anytime the planet alters at all, scream climate change for pushing a political policy forward. And that's exactly what happened. So we should recognize that use of language.
Democracy, uh, diversity. I mean, what
That's one of that's coming. Diversity is
of
coming.
course, and this is something that I had a number of people on the show talk about how it has been a Marxist technique for over a century to redefine words uh, so that you're having a different conversation than the one you think you're having.
Mhm.
Now, where's Restoration of America located?
So they have multiple offices. I'll be moving to their Florida office, which is exciting for
Oh.
me. So I'll be in the warmth now. But yeah, as you're saying, it is a very real tactic pushed by Marxists throughout history and certainly perpetuated by the left now to control political conversations and narratives in their favor. And that's why it's important to understand it and understand what language is maybe being manipulated. So that's why I got very excited about this series and anything I could do to help out with it, because it's definitely needed. And I'm excited that Restoration of America is doing something about it, and working to combat it in a sense.
So what kind of thing are you doing to help out with it besides helping to, helping to publicize these videos?
Yeah, so my job with starting, I'm doing social media and marketing. So I've been helping to market them and push them out, basically, and come up with kind of content that goes alongside it to help circulate the ideas in general more.
Now, I think you told me you're a communications major.
Mhm.
So you're going into this position to sort of build on that and build on the actual practical experience that you had on social media with the American Spectator. Do you ever wonder, though, whether you would benefit from, at some point, more subject matter knowledge, whether it's in political science or history or theology? Because there's a point at which we can become so good at the messaging. This was not meant by way of, this is not a question by which I'm telling you what to do, but I'm thinking you're an effective messenger but you're going right into the messaging business, and you know what you believe, and you've read those American Spectator back issues and all those, but we need to keep growing and educating ourselves about the meat and potatoes. What are you doing in your life? It's kind of an awkward question, but I think you can handle it.
I think it's a great question. I'd say the first thing that just has naturally come is the school that I chose. So, Grove City College is an excellent school where we are forced to take humanities classes, which
Right.
include Christianity and civilization, civilization literature, Western civilization. And in those classes, and also just in the studies in general at the college, we're always focused on the canon, focused on history, and building that back knowledge. So, I feel coming out of Grove City that I've been able to sharpen my knowledge in that sense a lot, and also growing in my faith, sharpening my faith and my knowledge of theology has been extremely helpful and transformative in my life being in school here. So, just in general, I would say that there's definitely been that back knowledge built even more than my major, if that makes sense. So, even more than what I've studied in my major, I think I've taken away the more foundational knowledge that Grove City prioritizes. And also I read on my own. So I always say I've always been not the biggest fan of school. The reason being I enjoy learning, but I don't have time to learn on my own as much when I'm in school and I have all of the things that I have to keep track of in school. But I love reading. I love keeping up with things, and the kind of books that I read are normally of that sense. They're not fiction, they're more nonfiction, or in a way to help me learn more. I like reading old books a lot more than newer books. So with that considered, that's how I really try to stay anchored. And also, I'll add to this that I have tried to avoid DC as much as possible for a reason. The reason being that I think that once you're completely immersed in the political space and you're looking at the news all day, every day, you do forget the foundation, you forget the history, you kind of forget those things. And I never wanted that to be me. I wanted to be away from politics where I could prioritize my faith, where I could prioritize always learning and developing my knowledge more. And then again, going into politics with that lens. So I really try in my life to have that balance where I'm anchored in other things and then I'm approaching the politics, not the other way around, not being overly immersed in the current events of things, if that makes sense. So that's
It
what I
makes
try.
perfect sense. Would you say that that is an important part also of the conservative mission is to urge people to think of learning and education as something that's not mere, recently had an exchange with a bunch of people, including some sophisticated people. One was a physician and one is, why bother learning algebra? You never use algebra in your whole life. And I was not particularly good at math compared to other things,
I'm not a fan of math personally either.
but I am positive that the programming that my brain experienced by virtue of learning algebra and trigonometry, geometry and calculus has enabled me to be better at understanding the world around me, even in subtle ways that I'm not running regressions, uh, or taking derivatives of things, but I have an understanding of the world, how the world works. And I'm not an historian, but by virtue of all the history that I learned, I'm able to have the perspective on things. That seems to be an idea that has really been lost. And I think conservatives need to be the better educated people.
I completely agree. And just in the sense of, I think being keeping up with history, right? And what I mean by that is instead of, again, just being on Twitter all day and working in politics, which a lot of the movement who works in politics are very immersed in current events, which is great. You can respond and comment on them. But people are far better served as citizens in general who are just voting and trying to keep up with things, which is a really seemingly impossible task when the news changes so quickly and there's all sorts of things coming at you from different directions. It's hard to keep up with everything, know what the right thing is. But the best way to do that is to be anchored in other things and to be reading other things, looking not just at current events, but at past events. And then, as you said, be able to draw connections from that. I think that that's the way. I mean, and conservatives should encourage that and should be doing that because, again, I think it's easy to get out of touch with the mission in a sense if you forget those background things.
Well, you're helping us remember them, Grace. It's great catching up with you. And w- I'd like to think of a way that we could do it on a more regular basis. I don't want to, clog up too much of your time. But on the other hand, I want to retain a, a spot, as you get bigger and bigger. You, it's very exciting what you're doing at Restoration of America, and I'm gonna take a closer look at it myself and be looking out for you. And please be sure and let everybody know what you're doing. It's very exciting.
Yeah, well, and thanks so much for having me. And I really would enjoy that because even now I feel like we just scratched the surface barely where we could talk about so much more.
Yeah,
So
well,
I
let's
would
talk
love to
about that.
come
Maybe we should do
on.
a series on something.
Yeah, exactly. But
And
it's been, yeah, a pleasure to join in. Yes, I'll continue to let you know what's going on
thank
and
you,
be
Grace.
sharing it on my social media.
Continued success. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.